Okay, I'm going to go over the homework using this screen recording. So maybe I can explain some of the application of the rules and you can get a better idea of why you got some of them wrong. I gave you or I'm sending you your homework from last week too. And I wrote a lot of comments in that. So please look at those and try to figure out what you got wrong. Next week we'll have a Zoom class. It will be all review. We're not going to learn much new other than a PowerPoint I'm sending you, which is a lot of review this week, plus a bit on definitions from Chapter 9. So let's go through some of these. The first one, no wooden objects are glass objects. Some glass objects are not tables. Therefore, some tables are wooden objects. So what we have here is a conclusion from a negative premise. This rule tells you that when you have two negative premises, which we have here, we have no and we have some are not, you cannot have any conclusion at all. So immediately when you see two negative premises, you know that it's just not a valid syllogism. You also have here another rule violated. This is a positive conclusion, and that cannot follow from even just one negative premise in the syllogism. So you can have one negative premise. You can have like an A proposition and an E proposition, but if you have one negative premise, the conclusion must be negative. So you have two rules violated here. And I'm not going to go through all of these. If we have the same rules violated, we won't go over again how it's applied. But we have here an illicit minor and illicit major. So this involves our little chart over here. And because we're going to be talking about distribution, and in this chart you have propositions, all four propositions, and whether the terms in them are distributed. And this is always true. So in A propositions, the subject term is always distributed and the predicate term is never distributed, for example. So here we want to look at our major or minor term, and your major term is boring games. Major term is always the predicate of the conclusion, and your minor term is video games. So let's see. This is an A proposition. So we know that in an A proposition, the subject is distributed. You can look over here for that. And you see that the subject, video games, is not distributed in the premises. So video games, you go up to the minor term, it's a I proposition, and I propositions, both terms are undistributed. So you have your illicit minor term. The minor term video games is distributed in the conclusion, but not in the premise. The major term boring games is the predicate of an A proposition that is the conclusion. So it's undistributed. So it's not, there's no rule violated here because it's not distributed in the conclusion, and that doesn't even get you going with illicit major because it has to be distributed in the conclusion but not in the premises. This one we have an undistributed middle. Our middle term is the term that shows up in both of the premises, but ideally not in the conclusion. If it does show up in the conclusion, you have a rule violated. That's middle term in the conclusion. Middle term is lilies. Both premises are I propositions. With I propositions, both terms are undistributed. So middle term has no chance of being distributed, and you have the rule 3 violated. This one is actually valid. And you can go through each of these and see how nothing is violated. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll give you a couple. So there's 3 terms: edible things, toxic things, and candles. There's not 4 terms. There's and the middle term is toxic things. So you know this because the middle term is what's repeated in the premises, ideally. Toxic things is not in the conclusion. So middle term in the conclusion's not violated. One more. Let's look at middle term being distributed. So this rule 3 tells you that the middle term has to be distributed at least once in the premises. And here we have our toxic things, and it is the predicate of an E proposition in the major premise. And let's go over to our E proposition. And, whoops, sorry. E proposition, both distributed. So you've satisfied this, that the middle term is distributed at least once. That's all you need. So that's a valid syllogism. You can go through the other ones as well. You can also look at this and say this is an EAE and it's in figure 2. So you can go to your chart, which is, I think I have it here. Yeah. EAE figure 2. You can see it's a figure 2 because of where the middle term is placed. And because it's an EAE, it is, sorry, I'm having trouble getting my chart up here. Let's, EAE, Caesarea. And it's in the second. So you would have been able to tell if you're like, I really don't feel like going through all of these rules and seeing if they're violated. You could have just looked at what type of propositions that you have and where the middle term is placed. And since it's the predicate of both premises, here's your figure 2, and that tells you EAE2. Look at line 2 of the chant, and there you have Caesarea. That's another way to look at that. Let's see this one. Positive conclusion after negative premises. You have a some feathered creatures are not flying creatures, and that is a negative premise. So you have to have a negative conclusion, even though you have this one positive premise here. All birds are feathered creatures. You have to have that. So you have that violated. We have another illicit minor or major. Let's just do this because I want to go over the distribution again for you. So here you have your minor term, extreme patriots, and your major term, violent protesters. And you can go to your O proposition, because it's an O proposition, and you can see that the major term is distributed. And because it's the predicate of an O proposition. And because it's distributed in the conclusion, it has to be distributed in the premise. So go up to your major premise, and you'll see it's an I proposition, and you might know by now I propositions, they are never distributed. Neither term is distributed, and so immediately you can see that the I proposition, the O proposition predicate, which is distributed, makes this a illicit major. This one, undistributed middle. So the middle term is the term that ideally shows up in both of the premises, but not in the conclusion. Middle term here is shy people. And the middle term is, it's an I proposition here, so neither term is distributed. It's an A proposition here, and the predicate of an A proposition is never distributed, and the middle term must be distributed at least once, so Rule 3 is violated. Some superstitious people are people who have seen ghosts, etc. We've looked at both of these, so I don't think we have to go through this again. If you didn't get it right, try to figure out why you didn't, using probably this chart, at least for Rule 4. For Rule 6, it should be pretty straightforward. Let's see, middle term in the conclusion. We have our middle term, which is myths. So it should show up in each premise. It should not show up in the conclusion. And so you have an invalid syllogism. And then again, you have your conclusion from negative premises. You can't have a conclusion from negative premises. The minute you see the E proposition and the O proposition, you know that the syllogism is invalid. This is the fallacy of 4 terms. This is, let me show this to you. This uses segregation in two senses. So it may look like a perfectly good syllogism, and nothing may be violated until you look closely and say, hey, they're talking about segregation in that sense of blacks being segregated from whites. Here they're talking about a very benign sense of segregation, which is just separation. And you can segregate your clothes. You could have white clothes in one area of your room and black clothes in another, and it's not actually bad. But there is this very bad sense of segregation that they're talking over here. So there's two senses of segregation, and that actually makes the syllogism have four terms instead of just three. So those are the answers to this, explained to some extent. And I hope you go over your questions and see where you got, if you got anything wrong, where you went wrong. And that's a good review, and it should help you understand all 7 of the rules. And I will send out the PowerPoint later today for the rest of the course, and we'll meet up again next Tuesday at 2. I'll talk to you later.